Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I believe this is podcast number 4 for 2024, and it is our third in a row to feature a guest. And we have a very esteemed guest here who's going to introduce himself in a second. I'm Jared, and I'm Adam, in case you forgot since last week. And now we will let our guest introduce himself.
I'm Marat Grinberg, and I'm a professor at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, and great to be here with Jared and Adam.
Yeah, well, Jared is going to do his best not to interrupt you.
I will try hard. Yes, commentator 6 and commentator 7 on our DEI podcast. I am sorry if I come across as interrupting. I will do my best. But what I'm doing is intervening and ensuring the conversation flows.
Intervening.
That's right.
It's an intervention. It's an intervention. But I suspect that I'm interfering while I'm trying to intervene. You know, that's the way I see it, I guess. So let me just add that Dr. Grinberg is a very, very esteemed, venerated scholar in Russian Jewish studies, pioneering in many respects because he just published a book, which he will talk about, on the Soviet Union, Jews in the USSR after World War II and their reading habits. And this intersects, of course, with anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the USSR, which we've talked about in previous shows. So he will have his expertise on the USSR. He'll be able to talk a little bit about anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism in the USSR, and he grew up there too. So he's a child witness, if you will, to some of the going-ons in the aftermath. And what year did you emigrate?
93.
And you were how old?
16.
Okay, so you remember the USSR, right?
Yeah, pretty well.
Yeah, okay. So, and he is also at Reed College, which, as most of our viewers probably know, is a hotbed of anti-Zionist activity because of their left leanings and the insertion of Palestine into their lefty causes. And he's experienced a handful of incidents there as well, which he is going to talk about as well. So we have a great deal to talk about tonight. And I'm going to turn the mic over to Marat, and we will let him begin in any way he wishes to begin.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So maybe I'll start with my writing, my scholarship, and how that is related to some of the things that you've been discussing on your podcast and kind of what we're experiencing after October 7th on American campuses and in life in general. So my latest book, the one that
I'm putting up my finger before I interrupt this time. I just, for our viewers who have watched or have not watched previous episodes, our episode with Izabella Tabarovsky, I highly recommend you watch it if you haven't. And I do discuss Marat's book in that episode.
That's right. Yeah. And so this book, The Soviet Jewish Bookshelf, Jewish Culture and Identity Between the Lines, published by Brandeis University Press, came out last year, and it was just recently reviewed by Jared in Jewish Journal. A wonderful, very insightful review. And so in this book is an attempt to excavate, understand post-World War II, post-Stalin Soviet Jewish culture, experience, Soviet Jewish experience through the idea of reading. The questions that I'm asking in the book are how Jewish knowledge disseminated in the Soviet Union, where there was no public space for expressing Jewishness, where anti-Semitism in all sorts of ways and manifestations surrounded Soviet Jews, and at the same time, Soviet Jews had a distinct understanding of themselves as Jews, and did have what I call Soviet Jewish culture, which was fragmentary, incomplete, but a culture nevertheless. And to talk about culture, we need to talk about knowledge. And so that's where this idea of reading comes in, and the idea of the bookshelf. How I primarily look at books that were published officially by the Soviet government. I don't look too much at what was published in Samizdat and these various clandestine networks.
For our readers, can you explain what Samizdat are to our viewers?
Samizdat is essentially clandestine network of publishing, which developed as such things develop in authoritarian, totalitarian regimes, and it was very, very important, but it was accessible to a select few. It was primarily available to those who were in the larger cities, in the capital, in Moscow, Leningrad, maybe Kiev, but certainly not where my family was, in the periphery in Ukraine. And so I look at the books that were published officially, discussing how Soviet Jews derived knowledge about Jewish history, Judaism, Israel, all sorts of things, just kind of using reading in an experiential way, bolstering their identity through reading, and again, in a fragmentary fashion, putting all of these all of these fragments together, and often reading between the lines. Some of the books did indeed contain an explicit information about all of these things, but often one needed to read between the lines, and the authors wrote between the lines, kind of counting on the readers to dissect and to decode and to figure things out. So one portion of the book deals specifically with literature about Zionism and Israel that was published in the Soviet Union, primarily after the Six-Day War, when the Soviet Union broke diplomatic relations with Israel and became a vehement enemy of Israel on the world stage. And really at that point, even though the Soviet Union was never a big friend of Israel, even at those points when it sort of supported it, but after the Six-Day War, as I said, it really becomes a vehement enemy of Israel, of Zionism, an open supporter of the Arab states, and the Soviets, primarily the KGB, really develop an anti-Zionist science, very much seeing Zionism as a new form of Nazism, as the most vile and vicious and pernicious thing in the world. And so tons and tons of literature about this was published, this propagandist literature, and the numbers are staggering. And the interesting thing is that a lot of this literature was purchased, obtained, gotten by Soviet Jews. And so you would find these brochures and volumes, and I can show some of them in the Soviet Jewish bookcases. Why did Soviet Jews buy them? Well, sometimes they bought them in order to destroy them. And there are all sorts of kind of urban legends about, one anti-Zionist, the next anti-Zionist book coming out, and Soviet Jews running, getting all the copies so that they could burn them and destroy them. So these are not really verifiable cases, but there was something like that, something, resembling that. But in many, many cases, they bought them in order to read them not so much between the lines, because it was pretty anti-Semitic literature, but by what I call crossing out the lines, to get some information, just a little bit of information about Israel, about Zionism. And interestingly, in this propagandist literature, which was sometimes written by people who were obsessed with Israel, they were sort of experts in Middle Eastern affairs, Middle Eastern history. They saw themselves as experts in Jewish history. Some of them even knew some Hebrew. And so you could actually gather some information about Zionism from these volumes. They would mention some of the, classical Zionist thinkers, from Herzl to Jabotinsky, Israeli politicians. One example that I describe in the book is this volume, which unfortunately I don't have a copy, and it's about IDF, Israeli Defense Forces. And again, very much presenting Israeli army as this horrible reactionary thing, but at the same time listing all their victories and the tactics they use. And at the back of the volume, you had the ranks in Hebrew, and so that type of information. And one person I interviewed for the book, who's a father of my close friend in Israel, also came from Ukraine, like I did, and he was telling me how he, living in provincial Ukraine, was just, when he found that book, he just devoured it, and it played such an important role in bolstering his Jewish pride. And so there are many examples like that. And when I was doing research for my book, I was in Israel, and I went to one of the few remaining secondhand Russian bookstores. And I don't know if it still exists, but it was in the old bus stop in South Tel Aviv. And so that bookstore, their shelves, they're just filled with this anti-Zionist literature, anti-Israel literature, which means that the Olim, right, the immigrants from the Soviet Union who came to Israel, they brought these books with them. And so it's an interesting phenomenon, which again kind of shows that you really need to know the context in order to understand how things like that, the role that they had and how they played out for Soviet Jews. But a great majority of Soviet Jews in dealing with this literature, they knew what they were dealing with. They certainly knew there was anti-Semitic, and they knew that when those books talked about Zionists, they talked about Jews. And there are so many parallels that we can draw in. Izabella Tabarovsky talked about that a little bit. There are many parallels between the anti-Zionist forces of today in the West and the language that again was propagated, kind of invented in the halls, in the halls of the KGB. Although the context, as I said, the context is different, right? The context, of course, there is.
I'm just trying to imagine something here since you brought that up. Forgetting the discursive links for a second here in terms of the visual propaganda, the close parallels and the way that the way that Israel is described is important here. Imagine that we have authoritarian or totalitarian state of sorts that controls information, and the only literature that we have access to is the literature produced by the radical left today in the way they characterize anti-Zionism and or the way they characterize Israel. Could we read those texts in the same way that you read those? Would we be able to, could I read Jasper Puar's The Right to Maim, and will I be able to learn anything of value about Israel if I have no other sources available?
I think one, potentially theoretically could, and this is something that's sort of a little research project that I have now. So I want to look at the books that were published in the US by the American communists who were in close contact with the USSR. So I can show you some of these books. So for instance, a book like this, Anti-Semitism and Zionism, Selected Marxist Writings.
What's that, from the 70s?
That was published. This is later. This is 1987. So this is very much kind of during the perestroika period. But at that point, though, 87, there is still, there is some talk of improving relations between Israel and the USSR, but the anti-Zionist stuff is still coming out strong in the Soviet Union, and actually some of the worst kind, because you also have actual anti-Semitism on the rise in the Soviet Union at that point.
With groups like Pamyat.
Yes, exactly. And these ultra-nationalist groups, Russian fascist groups. So a book like this, an earlier book, and this author I'm particularly interested in, Hyman Loomer, who was a pretty prominent American communist, and so Zionism, its role in world politics, which again really replicates that language, the Soviet language, or which way Israel. So anyway, they were in close contact. So my project is actually to go to the archives of the American Communist Party at NYU and see if I can find correspondence and what kind of a relationship they were with, because you can look at. Also, what's interesting is that this anti-Zionist Soviet literature was translated into English, and was there for the Western American consumption. So, for instance, this book, which is one of the classics of this post-67 Soviet Zionism, Caution Zionism by Yuri Ivanov, so he was one of those who very much, first of all, he was obsessed with Jews. Second of all, and they're all sort of conspiracy theories, how he died, etc. And second of all, he really thought that he did have kind of considerable knowledge about Israel, Jews, Zionism, Hebrew. And interestingly, and this is what's, what I write in my book, this kind of evolution of Soviet anti-Zionist thought. And we'll see if I can find it at the very beginning. So this is the first footnote in this book, and it says, it should be noted that one of the demagogic methods of defending Zionism against all attacks on Zionism as a whole is to qualify them as anti-Semitic acts. So this is exactly what we're hearing today, right? The accusations that these, pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian events that are happening on campuses, right? They're not anti-Semitic, they're not anti-Zionist. This is exactly what Ivanov is saying. Don't tell us that we're anti-Semites. We're not. We're anti-Zionist. And then he says, as for attacks on Zionist ideology in particular, since formally it purports to be concerned with the setting up of a Jewish state, the Zionists declare them to be encroachments on the right of the Israeli people to self-determination. So again, kind of drawing this interesting distinction between Jews and Israel, and that the idea that Israel represents Jews is just bogus. And then it says, we reject these base methods just as resolutely as we support the right of the Israeli state to exist and the right of the Israeli people to rid themselves of the services of Zionist leaders who are jeopardizing their future. So this is interesting, right? Again, this is a classic of Soviet anti-Zionism. That says from the get-go, we recognize the right of Israel to exist.
What does that mean? Hold on. What does that mean?
Well, I think it means that I'm not, this is a sort of disclaimer, but it's an interesting disclaimer, which again has parallels in what we're hearing today. If you go to the later volumes, you don't have any you don't have any of that. Even, the later anti-Zionist volumes published in the 1980s, they first of all, they say Jews do not constitute a people at all. These are kind of these disparate groups. And it even says that Yiddish, which was always recognized in the Soviet Union as a Jewish language, it says Yiddish is not a language at all. So it goes even that far. So being blatantly anti-Semitic, at least at the beginning, right? These KGB operatives who, present themselves as scholars of Middle Eastern Zionism, they're saying, we recognize Israel's right to exist. Maybe not as a Zionist state, but,
So what then? As what?
As I don't know. I guess the point that I'm making is that some of the things that we're hearing today, a lot of what we're hearing today, is even a step further.
Do they believe any people have the right of self-determination, or just not the Jews?
I mean, the huge part of Soviet policy going as far back as, the early Soviet Union was precisely the idea that people, ethnic groups have a right to self-determination, right?
Within the confines of a communist state.
Within the confines of the communist state, but that's of course the whole idea of the Soviet Union.
Wasn't there a Jewish region in the Soviet Union?
Of course,
Jewish
yes.
Autonomous Oblast.
Yes, Birobidjan, right? And that was the idea. Jews are an ethnic group, and so their national language is Yiddish, and they have a right to self-determination as well.
But in many ways, that line that the Jews aren't really a nation, that goes back to the original Bolshevik policy. I mean, Stalin wrote that famous essay of what is a nation and said the Jews are not a nation. And, it just seems for whatever reason, the Bolsheviks did a 180 on that by the end of the Civil War. Perhaps they were influenced by the Bund. Perhaps they realized that maybe it's in their interest to declare the Jews to be a nation. I have no idea why, and nobody's ever been able to
do you think that this is all just a red herring? Well, red herring, is one way of putting it, but that the real problem for the Soviets is that Israel is a Western ally, and that's really what it boiled down to.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, a huge part of why the Soviet Union turns against Israel in stupid ways is that, yes, they very much they see that, it's not going to be the Soviet forepost in the Middle East, and Israel is very much allied with the United States, with the West, and so they give up on Israel in a sense, but then they fully align themselves with the Arab states, and in the process, again, kind of create this anti-Zionist ideology. And then they discover in the process that a lot of this anti-Zionist stuff really becomes extreme and becomes part of the growth of Russian ultra-nationalist forces, fascist forces, and it's already happening in the 1970s, in the 1980s. And so these KGB operatives are afraid of the kind of the baby that they created, and they were torn, right? How far do we let these anti-Semites run? Which also shows that the Soviet ideologues were not very smart. And there's a lot of it's hard to find logic sometimes in what they do and how they do it. But I guess the point that I was making, that there is an evolution to Soviet anti-Zionist thought. They seem to be a little, more careful at the beginning than they become later. which also allowed the Soviet Jews to, as I said, read this by crossing out the lines. And, here's a quote from Herzl. Here's a quote from Jabotinsky. Interestingly, they quote Hannah Arendt. They like to quote Hannah Arendt as, as somebody who opposed Zionism. But if you take it, if you take a look at Soviet literature about Israel before the Six-Day War, so for instance, this volume, which is called The State of Israel, its place in politics, published in 1958. This book is certainly, it's a scholarly book. It's certainly critical of Israel, but it is more or less, it's informative. I wouldn't say it's objective, but it's certainly informative. And there's a huge difference between this and this. Yeah. And so one can imagine, again, had these Soviet ideologues been smarter, they would have continued with this, and keeping in mind that the Socialist Party in Israel was at the front well until the Begin comes to power when in late 70s, right? They could have played the game differently. And in the early 60s, that's another thing I discuss in my book. There were quite a few cultural ties between Israel and the Soviet Union. Translations of Hebrew literature that were published in the Soviet Union, different ties, and of course the Israelis were interested in maintaining ties to help the Soviet Jews, etc. So the Soviets could have played it differently, but they didn't. Yeah, and all of that was of course happening within the authoritarian atmosphere, which is not what we're talking about when we're talking about today, the United States, right, where students choose to align themselves, with these forces, and so yeah. So it's an area that requires, I think, a lot of nuance, when we're talking about these parallels.
The quoting of Herzl and Jabotinsky, I mean, the people on the left do that all the time. They keep pulling quotes in them and saying, see, Herzl was an imperialist because he has it with the word colonialism in there, even though in that context, colonialism does not mean what we use it today. So is that a similar thing, what they were doing there? Are they taking quotes that are choice for their
they were taking they were taking quotes to sort of, to condemn and to impugn. But again, imagine, if you're in the Soviet Union, were to just say out loud the word Jew, it would be just unheard of, right? I mean, if somebody just said it out loud in a public setting, you would either provoke laughter or some hateful remark. So here you're picking up a book that's published officially and that talks about these Jewish thinkers. So it doesn't matter even what they're saying or how they're being quoted, just the fact that you have a book that talks openly about Jews is like mind-blowing. Yeah. Or these books that were published, they were called Белая книга, which is the white book. And they were coming out later when you have already the Aliyah, immigration of Soviet Jews allowed to, in the 1970s, those who were allowed to go to Israel. And so these books were published, and they're filled with stories about those Soviet Jews who went to Israel, found out that it's such a horrible place, and they're begging to be allowed to go back to the Soviet homeland. So it's filled with these stories, yeah? But these books in particular were a hot item because, again, they talked about Israel. They openly talked about Zionism. Sometimes they were quoting from, this underground literature because it talked about all these Zionist activists. And so, again, within that Soviet context, it just became such a hot item, which is why I think all of these books that I showed you, apart from the English translations, I bought them in Tel Aviv in that secondhand bookstore. And just like the current, anti-Zionists are drawing this distinction between the evil Zionists and Israel and the good Jews, the Jews affiliated with JVP or whatnot. These Soviet ideologues were doing the same thing, right? Saying they're good Jews, the Jewish workers in our Soviet homeland, those who speak Yiddish, or maybe those who live in Birobidzhan, or just, good workers who also assimilated into Soviet society, and the evil Zionists. So those tactics are similar, despite the fact that the context, this contexts are different.
And there were litmus tests in the USSR, right? I mean,
And there were
they
litmus
did call
tests.
on certain Jews to publicly denounce Zionism, even
Of course.
if they were non-Zionists and they had no interest in even discussing it. I found that in my own research with some humorists I was following in Odessa in one of their daily Odessa Gazeta. I don't remember which paper it was, but they had a humor column that ran a few times a week, and then suddenly out of the blue in 1967, they're saying we condemn Zionism. Right, there was like a break from their usual humor stuff, and they're just three of them are publicly condemning Zionism. I've been told at least one of them lives in Israel now. Obviously, someone above them told them that they have to do this. They don't have a choice.
Right.
So I'm concerned when I look at the left today that Jews are being and will be increasingly subjected to litmus tests, and the law clubs at Berkeley issue is a perfect example of that. They won't let Zionist speakers speak. Well, how do you know someone's a Zionist? I imagine they're only going to subject people who are Jews to that. And what are they going to do? They're going to say, you can't speak here unless you publicly denounce Zionism. It's like, what if I never think about Israel? But if you're going to force me to denounce it, I mean, I'm not going to denounce the state. Why should I do that? Half the
And
world
again, you know, in the Soviet context, that was a matter of being fired from a job, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so on the one hand, there were, you know, like there was anti-Zionist Soviet committee that was established that had a number of very prominent figures, you know, actors and writers, but on the bottom, it was happening at every single, you know, professional meeting, at a factory, at school, of course, all the party meetings, right, where you were just you were expected to do that. And of course, you know, if you need to feed your family, you need to keep your job. I mean, very few were willing to, or were brave enough to stand up. Not even brave, but again, you need to survive, right? Not everybody could just go into the, you know, into the hiding or resistance. Very few could do that. So it was completely widespread. Yeah.
And they tapped into popular anti-Semitism to a certain extent.
Of course.
Yeah, because I mean the roots run deep in Russia, and you know they maybe contained it in the 1920s and even to a certain extent in the 1930s. But once the government starts encouraging, you know, just use the word Zionist and it's okay, there seems to be this current that never went away with the revolution, despite their attempts to their maybe half-hearted attempts to eradicate anti-Semitism in the early Bolshevik period.
Yeah. And the bottom line, again, that interchangeability of Jew Zionist, you know, for the way that the word Zionist was used by Soviet Jews, I mean, like in my own family, and again, it was very representative, to be a Zionist was just to be like an active Jew, right? It did not mean that you're, you know, pro-Israel, whatnot, but just, you know, to be a Zionist was to be a Jew who actually cares about being, you know, about being Jewish. And another bottom line is that just in this incredible sense of solidarity that Soviet Jews, great majority of Soviet Jews, had with Israel. So these attempts by some, you know, by some in the scholarly community to kind of rewrite that history and to say that actually that was not the case. No. However we judge it, however we, you know, we evaluate, again, taking the complexity into account, but Soviet Jews predominantly had this incredible sense of solidarity. And it's no wonder that today some of the most vocal pro-Israel voices in the US, right, or are coming from the former Soviet Jews, or that in Israel, so many of Soviet Jews see themselves on the right, and a pretty militant, when it comes to issues of security and, you know, things like that. So that's just a historical fact, which I think.
And the fact of the matter is, the Soviet Union, I mean, they defined the Jews as a nationality when they finally implemented internal passports and whatever, and you know, nationalist, Ivrei, you're a Jew. And given that they, for all intents and purposes, prohibited religion, and of course Zionism too, but nevertheless the Jews are still a nationality that can have national self-determination within a Soviet context. So the idea that the Jews are a nation was ingrained, and naturally they would gravitate to Israel because it's an ethno-national state.
Right. Yeah. And you know, and yeah, so that's why, again, that sense of solidarity was so was so strong.
And the whole interchangeability between the word Jew and Zionist, as much as the left tries to deny that, for all intents and purposes, they mean the same thing. I mean, they were called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, not the Protocols of the Elders of Judaism, right? I mean, the word Zion's in there, and if you read the contents, it's not about establishing a Jewish state, right? It's about controlling the world through diabolical Jewish means. It's about liberalism and democracy and the rule of law and capitalism.
Right.
So you can't just use the word Jew, Zionist instead of Jew and claim, you know, a get out of jail free card saying this is an ideology and that's it. It doesn't work.
Right. And yeah, I like to show, I included this in my, but this comes from Yevseyev. So this is one of the worst books called Fascism Under a Blue Star. And if you see, right, so here you have, you know, the swastika and the Magen David just enveloping the capitals of the world. And here on the cover, you have, you know, the Magen David. So the idea that Israelis are the new Nazis committing genocide. So this was already in vogue, you know, back in the day. And again, I wrote about this, and I think American Jews who are confronting these forces today, and frankly, are not prepared to really confront them, and they have a thing or two to learn from Soviet Jews. Again, keeping in mind the nuances and the differences in context, because I think we shouldn't be making kind of these, you know, kind of this, you know, A to B. No, that would be too simplistic. But as far as kind of the larger experience of Soviet Jews when it comes to this, I think is very informative and useful.
Within, even if it's a bubble, within the bubble of the anti-Zionist left, you know, the conditions are disturbingly similar. And yeah, you won't get shipped off to the gulag, but you could be canceled in their realm in various ways, and it could have a lasting impact on your life.
Yeah.
And who's to say what'll happen if and when they get power? But we see it already in the university systems taking place. So it is a real problem. Yeah, I was thinking of reading Caution Zionism, and because I downloaded the copy in English, and just to read it and see if, you know, the weigh it against what Tabarovsky has written in some of her essays, and to, you know, draw the connections here and maybe just write something short about it. But I'm not sure I could, you know, stomach the literature of actually going through that. One gets
it's there. It's certainly there. And again, as I said, that book is one of the kind of softer ones, if one could say that, and sort of more palatable. The later stuff is just pure, just filled with this anti-Semitic hate. But I mean, I give this one example in my book, and it's a personal example, and it concerns a book called Judaism без прикрас, which was published in Ukrainian in the 1960s, before the
Judaism Without Beauty, or
yes, Judaism Without Beauty, Judaism Unadorned.
okay.
By this guy Trofim Kichko, and it was published by the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, and it was this horrific diatribe against Judaism, right?
It was withdrawn, wasn't it? Withdrawn from publication?
Yes, right. And it just not only the text was just so vile, but it was filled with these caricatures, as you know, that were so evocative of the Nazi stuff. And so yes, when the Western communists learned that it was published, but the Italian communists in particular, they confronted the Soviets and said, like, what are you doing? Why are you promoting this anti-Semitic garbage? And the Soviets got a little cautious, and they said, yeah, like, the book is okay, but it could lead one to interpret it in wrong ways. And so, you know, it was kind of sort of shut down. Although Kichko went on to produce more stuff, and he was beloved by this anti-Zionist crowd later on. But so what happened when I was in 5th grade, I think 6th grade, a friend of mine who was also Jewish, he said, look what I found in my parents' bookcase, and he showed this book to me. And he was like, you know, look at this. This is all about Jews. And I said, okay, can I read this? So he left, and I read it.
Was it in Ukrainian or Russian?
In Ukrainian, yeah. And I was absolutely disgusted. And not even, I think, sort of on an intuitive level, because it was filled with these supposed quotations from the Talmud, and just saying again how horrific and vile and reactionary Judaism is. And I just I just felt that this was bad. And so I just tore it apart and I threw it out. And it was the only time in my life that I ever did anything like that with a book. And so my friend, came back a few days later and he said, give the book back to me. And I said, I can't because I destroyed it. And he was so angry. And he's like, how could you do that? It was a Jewish book. Like we could do something with it. It was about Jews, which again shows you that like anything that had the word Jew in it, was so valued. And then I discuss, writing about this in my Soviet Jewish bookshelf. I look at some of the things that Kitschko says, and again, you could actually like learn something from it. Yeah. Even within this vile context. And the interesting thing now, it is impossible to buy this book. Like there are no copies, and the ones that are out there are like in thousands of dollars.
Really?
Yeah.
Can I order it through interlibrary loan if I wanted to?
You can order it through interlibrary loan, yes.
You shouldn't have destroyed it then. You would have
I know.
collector's item that's worth
exactly. It would be a collector's
smoking
item.
Cigars and drinking scotch on this podcast somewhere on the beach.
Yep. And if I gave it back to my friend who now lives in New York, I imagine that they would have taken it with them. So that's a real life example again of sort of how that kind of Jewish knowledge was generated and how it functioned.
Was it translated into Russian or was it only in Ukrainian?
It was never translated into Russian.
Okay, so we're talking about a limited audience. And not that Russians can't wade their way through Ukrainian.
No, but again, if you were in Ukraine, you had no difficulty.
Right.
No difficulty reading it. Yeah. And I just, yeah. So that's kind of a real life example.
Well, I'm trying to, okay, you sent me the other day Hamas's official statement, their narrative about what happened on October 7th. And Adam, I do think we do need to record a little short podcast on that pamphlet. Yeah, because it's so outrageous, but what they say in it, okay, obviously everything they say about Israel is a complete lie, but it also flies in the face of their charter. Their charter is all about, Islam is a religion that's going to hunt down and kill every Jew behind every rock. That's an Islamic idea, and we need to implement it. And
that's what they just did.
Yeah, and this one's, they're saying Islam is a religion of peace. We only targeted military establishments. We don't hunt down civilians. Perhaps there were a few excesses. If they use the word excess, then it's a very Soviet thing, but I'm not sure they actually use the word excess in it. But that thing was clearly directed at the American left. That there was no way that they would write something like that for their own people.
Yeah.
It's in English, it's for the American left, and I just wonder, I wonder two things. One, I'm worried that people are going to read this in college campuses and consume it and take it to be accurate, and that certain anti-Zionists are actually going to assign it in their classrooms. And I think that's a genuine concern. But I'm also trying to think if there's anything to get out of that by reading between the lines, right? I skimmed it. I didn't read the whole thing. I should try reading between the lines and see if I could get any value of information about Israel in there.
Yeah, I don't know if you could do it. Again, I mean, the context matters, right? I mean, for us, within the context that we're in, I mean, I think it would be so difficult. But it's a document in English, right? Kind of put together nicely. It's this little brochure, right? And I think it is very much directed toward the Western audiences. What I found most interesting is that, there's a disclaimer there, which again is so similar to some of this Soviet anti-Zionist stuff when they're saying, we're not anti-Semitic. We have nothing against the Jewish religion. It's all those disgusting, vile Zionists, who are the occupiers and the...
Except that it's an atheist state. Right? You're talking about the USSR? So it's an atheist state. So they do have something against the Jews.
Exactly. So for the Soviets, it would be not Judaism. Of course, they hated Judaism as a religion, but it would be, the Jewish proletariat or just the good Soviet Jewish citizens, something like that. But the idea is the same, right? To separate Zionism and Israel from Judaism or from, the Jewish proletariat or from whatever. And of course, there are so many debates about politics and and what it means to be a Jew in the 1920s or whatever, 1930s. Of course, a different story once the Israel is created and has been now in existence for 75 years. I think that's what some of the people who are today kind of advocating for anti-Zionism are not being entirely honest, just sort of on an intellectual level, right? It is one thing to be an anti-Zionist, in the 1920s, Berlin, it's another thing to be an anti-Zionist in 2024, especially after October 7th. So there's kind of that disconnect. But they do, and you know, when I read this document, you know, put out by Hamas, their propagandists in English, I mean, there's so many similarities between them and JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, who are exactly saying, I hear that again from, you know, from some of the students on my campus who are associated with JVP, you know, not in my name, like my, you know, don't, you know, one student said something like, I hate this state, even though it uses the symbol that has become the symbol of my people. I assume referring to the Magen David, you know, the Jewish star. Like, so, you know, here is Judaism, this wonderful thing that we love, and here is this disgusting, you know, disgusting Israel. And so it's interesting that these Hamas propagandists, or whatever wing, again, I don't know exactly how that works, but that they're kind of, I think they understand that that might work, or will actually work.
Dov Waxman would call them the moderate wing of, was it Dov Waxman or Yair Wallach? Do you remember, Adam? Yeah, one of them called them the moderate wing of Hamas.
Yeah, right.
I don't think it was either one, but all right.
I thought it was one of them that tweeted it. Okay.
And
Apologies.
so they think, you know, that will work, that will work with this. You know, as we know, it is very much a fringe element within the larger Jewish community. But on certain campuses, it is still a minority, if we talk about JVP, but they're the ones who present themselves as the voice, you know, as the voice. That's how they present themselves to various kind of non-Jewish, you know, parts of the college community. And so,
yeah,
you know,
JVP in many ways is a bigger threat than SJP in terms of, because JVP could actually suck the Jewish community in. I mean, for a Jew to openly support SJP, even if their feelings are anti-Zionist, I mean, they're really crossing a threshold. There are some who do, of course, but it's still, I think, SJP terrain is still largely populated by non-Jews. Some people say JVP aren't real Jews either.
Speaking of colleges, why don't we talk about what is going on at Reed?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Okay. So what's going on at Reed? So first of all, just to preface, you know, Reed, elite liberal arts college in the Pacific Northwest, and you know, with really smart, very smart, capable students, and interestingly, Reed campus, by and large, at least historically, has been apolitical. In other words, there are no political organizations. There are no fraternities, sororities. The campus tends to go to the left by and large.
What about those protests over the Western Civ course that was going on for several years?
Yes. Which was happening in 2016 or so. But if you look at the larger history of the college, and there were moments, you know, during when there were protests regarding the apartheid in South Africa and things like that. But by and large, politics are not front and center on Reed campus, because the idea is that the life of the mind, and it is about learning, and it is about, you know, about that. But that has begun to change. And so since October 7th, there were quite a few events on campus organized by SJP. There's a chapter of SJP at Reed. And these events, I don't call them pro-Palestinian events, because I don't see them as advocating for Palestinian lives or rights or whatnot. These are completely pro-Hamas events. And events like, you know, walk out for Gaza, shut the campus down for Gaza. So the idea is to disrupt classes and just to walk out in the middle of the class, or, you know, and then our students the college students who are part of the SJP, they join with other groups that are not part of the college. And those, because it is Portland, you know, which is a hotbed for some of the radical stuff. So the anarchist groups, you know, radical socialists, they join with them. And so these are the type of events that were happening. And you know, the banners that they carry are something that we see on other campuses, you know, course, from river to the sea, mobilize the intifada everywhere. There is only one solution, intifada revolution, which they chant. One thing that I don't think anybody else was present, there's this banner that said Hitler would be proud.
That was it, Reed?
Yes, Hitler would be proud next to a Palestinian flag. And again, it could be interpreted in two ways. It could mean that Hitler would be proud because Jews were killed, Or it could mean, if we use this kind of anti-Zionist Soviet language in particular, it means that Hitler would be proud of Israel for committing genocide. Doesn't matter how one interprets it, just the very fact that in a US college campus, you have a banner.
Why
that
would
says
Hitler be proud of Israel for committing genocide?
Well, because they're genocidal, brothers.
Okay, it would confirm his beliefs.
It would
Okay,
confirm.
I see what you're saying.
I mean, it's all
in
nonsense.
an ironic
right?
sense. Okay, right.
And so, another interesting thing about Reed, and this is something that makes it, I don't know if unique, but one of the very few campuses, is that there was nothing from the other side. In other words, Reed has a very substantial student Jewish body, but there was absolutely nothing. Not one single pro-Israel event. Nothing. Partially because the Jewish students have been harassed and humiliated, and by the other side, for not condemning Israel, for feeling sympathetic, for being heartbroken after October 7th.
That's true at a lot of campuses, though. There's no Jewish equivalent on the vast majority of campuses of SJP, and Hillel.
That is true. But there is, one thing is to have something smaller. Another thing is to have nothing, right? There was just not a single hostage poster, just nothing.
No candlelight vigil or anything like that?
I think there was an attempt to organize something, and it was attended by literally like 4 or 5 people. I mean, it's, yeah. So yes, yeah. And so what happened specifically that concerned me is that also Reed does not have a program in Jewish studies. It does not have a Jewish center, does not have a Hillel. And there are a number of people who work in Jewish studies, but I am one of the few who teaches courses.
There's no Hillel there?
There's no Hillel.
But you have enough Jewish students for there to be a Hillel.
Yes, there's a Student Jewish Union, which is its own Reed thing. Yeah, but anyway, so our college newspaper was covering this event called Shutdown for Gaza. And one of the journalists, who was just a student, approached me asking to explain what it means, intifada everywhere, asking me as a Jewish studies expert. I said, of course, and I provided an explanation, saying, there were 2 intifadas, and talking about particularly the violence of the second intifada. I said this has nothing to do with the peace process. The whole point of the peace process was that the Palestinians would condemn terror, and this is not what's happening. And I said it's blatantly anti-Semitic because it threatens Jewish lives and threatens them everywhere. I mean, the language is explicit. Intifada everywhere.
Yeah, the word globalize is key. Once they throw that
globalize is key, exactly.
We want to attack diaspora Jews.
Right. And so when the article came out covering this event, all of my comments were included, and they were prefaced by saying, here's Professor Grinberg, who's a Jewish studies expert. And I was glad to see it. I was like, they're trying to be honest reporters, recording all of this, and actually providing context. So as soon as this was published, first it was published online, tons of hate comments coming from students, from members of the community, literally saying to the newspaper, to these journalists, how dare you ask the most Zionist professor on campus about any of this? Like, how can you even ask him, the Zionist? He doesn't even know Arabic. Like, how could he comment on the meaning of the word intifada? Like, intifada just means, rebellion. It has nothing to do with Israel. One comment said, how dare you ask this Soviet Jew about anything, right?
They always move the goalposts and say that words actually mean something else.
Right.
This is a very common tactic.
Exactly, right? It's like saying, what do you mean anti-Semites? Arabs are Semites, right? Yeah. I mean, how can it be against Jews?
And they seize on identity. Your words are not important. It's who you are that counts.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Judge your words accordingly.
Right. It was targeting me specifically because of who I am, even though I don't walk around campus with a large sign that says Zionist. I mean, and I don't bring my politics, whatever they are, into the classroom, but I am known as, as a supporter of Israel, and one of the very few, if not the only one, who teaches the Israeli material on campus. My case be literature and film. And so a few hours later, after the article was published, and all these comments came out. I just checked a few hours later, and I see that all of my comments are removed, completely removed. And there's an explanation provided by these journalists, these students, that says, you know, we were alerted to the fact.
I have the right, I'll read it. I have the quote right up. Update 11/11/5:52 p.m. The original version of this article quoted Greek professor Marat Grinberg on the history of the word, quote, intifada. At the time of the article's publication, the Quest was unaware that Professor Grinberg had previously expressed support for certain views on Twitter, which the editors found deeply troubling. So it's not even about what you had to say. It's about something that you said in your past. You shook hands with a Menshevik, if we want to Sovietize this, right? Had the Quest been aware of these views, the paper would have not quoted Professor Grinberg. When the paper became aware of these views, the editors made the decision immediately to remove the quotes. After being informed by the Student Press Freedom Initiative, that title alone tells you all you really need to know, that it was legal to do so. We have replaced Professor Grinberg's comments with a direct quote from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Or at least I didn't use AI to replace you. I guess that's a plus. We thank you, those who brought this to our attention. And there's another one, there's two others, right? The Quest was alerted the last sentence of paragraph 21 still made a reference to Professor Grinberg's quote. So it's your very existence that's a problem here.
Exactly, right?
Yes. There's another one. The Quest received comment from a representative of the college which said, the safety of our Reed campus community is the college's primary concern at any campus gathering. College leadership is aware of what took place at the rally. Okay, so that's that.
Yeah, that's different. But
Okay.
but this is, yeah. So that's exactly like, you know, like I had to be expunged to the fullest. Any mention of me had to be completely removed. And
you're being canceled.
I think that was the idea. The idea was to cancel me. And so interestingly, the Twitter stuff, so they're not referring to any of my actual tweets, because 99% of my tweets, which I rarely do, have to do with my scholarship. So what they looked at are some of the things I retweeted after October 7th, and clearly by disturbing, they mean pro-Israel. And I retweeted this tweet by, he's an Iraqi journalist. I can't think of his name now, but he's quite prominent. And he's one of the few voices, Arab voices, that is calling on Palestinians to, you know, abandon terror. And so that's what I was retweeting, where he was essentially saying, like, you got to stop Palestinians, right? You have to really kind of take agency, right, and be responsible for what you do. And another one that I retweeted was this thing that said, instead of saying from river to the sea, Palestine, you know, will be free, we should be saying from river to the sea, Israel is what you see. Yeah, which is kind of this classic subversive tactic. You take the language of those who hate you, you twist it around. It's a rhetorical exercise, but it's also a statement of fact, because no matter what your politics are, if you look at the map, Israel is what you will see today. Yeah. And so these are the two instances that they found reprehensible. So when the paper came out, when the newspaper came out, the paper version came out the next week. So I was not there at all, of course, but they choose to publish two letters to the editor. And one was from an alum who said that I represent violent eliminationism on campus. And it pointed to this tweet that I retweeted, and it said something like I should be investigated and they should be ashamed for even including me. And another one was from a current student that said literally, why would you ask a well-known Zionist about anything? Why would you ask a Soviet Jew about anything? Because Israel has nothing to do with Jews, period. So of course the newspaper decides what letters to the editor to publish. Did
the print version include the update, the explanation about the
removal? No. So the print version
was
as if I never.
Okay.
Yeah, and the article included all voices, right? Again, they interviewed SJP, the statement that was put out by the president of the college, all the voices. And that finally they choose, you know, they went not with Encyclopedia Britannica, they went with another kind of this great, you know, depository of Islamic.
Not the great Soviet encyclopedia.
Not the great Soviet. Would have been better. Anyway, so that's the story. To the credit of, I have to say, to the credit of my students, my classes last semester went on well, as they always do. Nothing happened in the classroom, and in the classroom.
Have you noticed the enrollment declining this semester?
No, no. You know, and in fact, last semester after October 7th, I was teaching a large course on Soviet science fiction. I spent good 20, 25 minutes talking about October 7th. You know, when I told the students, I said, it's not about politics, but it's about staring horror in the face. And I said, as a scholar of genocide literature and film, you look at the parallels between the Holocaust and October 7th, and that's what you see, right? So that's what and as I said, nothing happened, and there are really there are no change in enrollments. Yeah.
Have the faculty advisors for the newspapers spoken out?
So there are no faculty advisors.
Oh, okay.
It is a purely student run, even though it is still subsidized by the college because students pay fees, you know, and that's how it's supported. And you know, so far, after many conversations with the administration, nothing happened. Nothing happened. I think what I told the administration, I said, this is a clear case of defamation, censorship, erasure. Yeah. It's unethical, you know, and let's even leave all the other side aside. This is unethical. If these students want to actually become journalists, they need to understand that's not how honest journalists operate. And so I said, I don't want to be punitive, but you, the administrator, you can invite them for a conversation and explain to them what they did. And so the last word that I heard is that the students, after much deliberation, decided not to meet with me.
Not to interview you?
Not to meet with me.
Not to meet with you. Okay.
Not to have a conversation.
You're canceled.
Yeah. Which is kind of, you know, again, when you're talking about a small campus, which is what Reed is, where every professor is a well-known entity, and I'm a well-known entity, you know, who enjoy a good rapport with students and you know, and have, you know, raised generations of students. I've been there for 17 years. And so to say that students are you know, don't want to meet with the professor is kind of bizarre, and has all sorts of undertones, right? And so that's where we are. I haven't heard a story like that from other campuses, right? I mean, and so it's very disturbing, right? The tactics and what was, so I wrote an article, you know, a piece about that for Jewish Journal describing this, and kind of linking it back to my Soviet Jewish past. And I said, what was astounding to me is how quickly they turned from, you know, trying to be honest reporters to just being these just laborious censors, right? And just looking for every single instance. Oh, here he's mentioned. We got to eliminate. We just have to do this. And this was coming probably from fear and peer pressure for sure. Or wherever it was coming from. It's frightening that this is how young minds think, and that there are no forces that can tell them this is not okay.
I've talked to plenty of people who are under 30 who just think that cancel culture is okay under certain circumstances, and they don't have a problem with it. You know, they didn't have a problem with Netflix people walking out on because of Dave Chappelle's special that caused such an uproar from the LGBT community. And you know, Netflix is a private company. If they want to remove something, that's their right. And NBC canceled Bridget Loves Bernie because it celebrated intermarriage back in the 70s, or whatever network it was shown on. But if they're going to cave into mass pressure, you know, if people walking out saying you're not allowed to screen this, that's something else entirely.
Right. And also because, again, you know, the things like my goal here was to be pedagogic. First of all, to provide context, and then just like a context not politically colored, you know, and to be pedagogic and say, you know, it is not about peace process. It's actually not about reconciliation between the two peoples at all. No, it is about these slogans that are threatening to Jews, that call for violence toward Jewish lives. Yeah. And so when something like that you know, I think it doesn't matter what I would have said, as long as it was coming from me, once they identified me as a Zionist.
Well, that's the key point, right? They're
didn't
not referring
matter.
to their quote, they're referring to the Twitter.
Exactly. I could have said anything,
Yeah.
you know, but because it was coming from me, and again, it was, you know, those who wanted to cancel me, whatever. It's certainly a minority, as I said, like my own classroom. This was not reflective, but it's the atmosphere is you know, is charged with
It's a
that.
powerful minority, though.
A
Yeah.
powerful, for sure.
Yeah.
And that's the part that we really need to think about. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, no, you know, a vocal minority can do a great deal of damage, and that's until 2021 at least. I thought that the anti-Zionists in Jewish studies who are actually going to speak out, you know, in defense of the anti-Semites and support them rather than just remaining silent. I thought it was just a minority, but you know, after May 2021, when that statement got over 200 signatures, I said, okay, now we have a bigger problem here. And then the elephant in the room. If we just weed out the non-Jews from there, we're still talking about a couple of thousand Jews who signed that thing.
I don't understand why the newspaper doesn't have any faculty oversight.
Well, that's, you know, that's how it's set up. That's how it's set up. I mean, it's, you know, and so there are many instances in the past when the newspaper got into trouble. Honestly, I mean, it has a scandalous history.
Mhm.
It has a scandalous history, right? Whether something like that ever happened in other instances, I don't know. You know, where again, sort of somebody's comments, I know they certainly sometimes they comment without asking permission, you know, so, you know, stuff like that. But and you know, and those who are the editors are clearly you know, on the other side. And even though again, in this case, they did try, I think they did try to do some honest reporting. They were overwhelmed because after this event, the shutdown for Gaza, when the students went to downtown Portland, they went to our senators, you know, offices trying to break in. A number of students were arrested, and so they were reporting on all of that, and there was a lot of pressure on them, like, you know, what are you doing, kind of, you know, reporting about your own peers, you know, being arrested by the evil, whatever, government machine. In addition to that, you're quoting the Zionist, you know, who says that Intifada is not such a great thing. And so a lot of this comes from, you know, as I said, I mean, it's peer pressure. It's frankly lack of knowledge, but a lot of it is ideological.
What about faculty? Have you gotten support from other faculty? I mean, you don't have to badmouth anyone.
Yeah, there are certainly a number of faculty who express their support, but a large portion of our faculty is fully supportive of these events.
Is there a Middle Eastern Studies program?
We do not have a Middle Eastern Studies program, right? But you have faculty in the anthropology department, for instance, you know, who work on that part of the world, and so there's a large portion of the faculty who are very much, deeply anti-Israel, and who do not see October 7th as anything to be mournful about, but see it as an act of resistance, and certainly see, you know, and see any response by Israel as out of bounds, you know, and they saw it before Israel took any action.
Absolutely. They were saying it on October 8th, right?
Exactly.
So they were already prepared to start charging Israel genocide even before Israel, you know, did anything beyond launching a handful of, you know, rockets into Gaza.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So the question now is, I think, not just for me, my campus, but for so many of us on other campuses, is like, how do we go forward? What do we do, right? When it seems like when the other side is so powerful and sort of and controls the message, for lack of a better word. What do we do? What are our strategies? I don't know. I honestly, I don't know, because the situation is, I expected that it would be bad because it's been bad, you know, anytime, like when I teach, for instance, my course on global Jewish cinema, which includes Israeli films. So when it comes to that, you just say the word Israel in the classroom. It's just like, you know, in the Soviet Union, say the word Jew, you say the word Israel, and everybody freezes. It's as if you said something dirty.
These are people who signed up for the course?
These are people who signed up for the course. And again, it would only be a couple. It would only be a couple, but the whole, the whole atmosphere is charged with that. Again, to the credit of our students, once you start the discussion, once you provide the material, once you actually begin to analyze, the conversation can happen. But for me, the saddest thing that I've seen there's this letter by our alums that was put out. I think SJP called on them to do this, and it's very much anti-Israel, and it's signed by some of the students who took my courses in Holocaust literature, in Jewish literature. So these are the students who sat with, in the classroom with me, learning and studying and reading this, and later they sign a letter that says that Israel is a genocidal state.
Mm.
That's deeply sad to me. And
they read between the lines in your class.
Maybe they read
material.
They tried hard to read between. Yeah. There are others, of course, who took their lessons, and who, of course, there are those as well. But we're in a difficult situation, I think, which requires some, I think, pretty substantial thinking about looking at the forces, ideological forces that are putting this stuff out there, and some of those forces have become part of the institutions. And in a sense, it is systemic, right? I mean, kind of that word that people like to float around.
It is absolutely systemic. No,
and
absolutely.
Which makes combating it very, very difficult. Some are saying, we should just lose with dignity. And maybe, or we should just worry about the remnant, the remnant, those students who can still be convinced, still be talked to, and because talking to the Jewish students, on my campus, so many of them are saying, we're disturbed by what we see, but we don't know much about Zionism.
Yeah.
I never identified myself.
What does losing with dignity mean?
It means, going to the barricades. I don't know what that means. I
prefer the other approach, where you try to get open-minded students. If you can only get a few, that's enough. That's
what I'm saying, right? That remnant, or those who can be talked to, who say, I'm disturbed. I don't know much about Zionism, but I certainly feel some connection to Israel. I know that it is part of being a Jew. And maybe one student said, I find it hard to advocate for Israel right now. So you sit down and you talk. And even if you still disagree at the end, whatever, but you're kind of on the same page, because you understand, right, that Israel is an enormous part of what it means to be a Jew, period.
Yeah. We have colleagues who, claim expertise and then take their ideas on a roadshow, and are currently going from campus to campus, propagating this stuff as Jewish. Yeah. I mean, how do you fight that?
It's not just Jews. It's not just Jews. It's anyone who identifies with Western ideals ought to appreciate Israel and understand what it is.
Right. Yeah. And it doesn't mean that we need to be, I think it's one thing. There's all this talk about, the current government. Let's have all the political disagreements we want about Israel, but first you have to be informed. First of all, it's up to Israelis to decide what kind of government they're going to have. Second of all, you have to be informed in order to disagree, right? In order to have debate. So I think we need to, leaving kind of politics aside, because so much of that kind of clouds the conversation, and just going back to the basics. Because I said, it's one thing to be an anti-Zionist in a cafe in the 1920s Berlin.
Yeah.
It's another thing to be an anti-Zionist, whatever that means, honestly, today in 2024.
Yeah.
Yeah, and let's just be honest about that.
Palestine will be free from the river to the sea is blatant anti-Zionism, and perhaps something far, far worse than that. I mean, you're calling for the liquidation of Israel. You're not calling for the freedom of all people. You're calling for the replacement of one state with another. Otherwise, you wouldn't use the word Palestine in there. You'd say people, or you'd say Israel and Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. But they don't do that. And, I've realized, Israel/Palestine is a locution that's used often. I use it in class all the time. I assign Alan Dowdy's book, Israel-Palestine. But I've noticed there's now a trend to say Palestine-Israel and to put Palestine first. And I think that is the people doing that are very deliberate in making.
I have students that ask me about it and don't even say Israel at all. They just say Palestine. Like after 10/7, I've had students say, "Can I talk about what happened in Palestine, or can we talk in class about Palestine?"
Did you explain that that's not Palestine?
And I explain, what you mean, Israel.
Right. Yeah. No, it's little. I went to our bookstore today, and so there is a little stand where the rubric is indigenous voices. Okay. And then one book is I think it's called Occupied Lives, and it's about the West Bank, right? So it's a little thing like that. But first of all, what does that mean? That means that the indigenous to that piece of land are the Palestinians, right? And not the Jews. But of course it's only one little thing. And then you think about what's happening in the classrooms, and so I think, like Adam, I think you're right. It is about speaking to those few. I think it's a minority today. I don't think it's a minority in the wider community, but in so many campuses it is a minority. But supporting them, educating them, and raising the new generation. That's what it's about, because the overall situation is bad, right? And the other side has certainly worked very hard on mobilizing, on creating that narrative, right? On kind of rewriting history and presenting it as facts, and feeding it to that outside world and linking it to all these ideologies that are in vogue. Yeah. And some of them, again, date back to the Soviet stuff. And so we need to kind of put our heads together, but I'm not feeling terribly hopeful, to be like.
I got an evaluation, and this is my Jewish history till 1500 course, where they said, the student said, "I almost laughed out loud when you said you were a Zionist. I lost a lot of respect for you." This is Jewish history till 1500. Did I mention I was a Zionist? Perhaps once in passing. Okay. Did I mention Zionism in the course? Absolutely. When I was talking about the Zionist prism for viewing history, 70 AD, that's it. Boom, suffering
Right.
scholarship up until the Zionists. And I would say the Zionists would interpret this event as such, which is a
Right.
completely neutral.
When you say that you're a Zionist, you're not even stating what your political views are regarding policy. All you're doing is saying that you support a Jewish state of some kind.
Well, which is what I did. I added that explanatory variable. I'm just letting everyone know that I do support the right for the Jews to self-determination in their ancestral homeland. And it's a portion of Jewish identity. And I probably threw that in there because I kept talking about the Zionist narrative, and I didn't want them to think just because I was, historicizing and problematizing the Zionist view of history, which of course is problematic, as are all nationalistic views of history. I want to make it abundantly clear that
anyone who has a problem with Zionism wants to liquidate an entire state.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now I interrupted you this time.
Well, you've done it 3 times tonight, but that's okay. I'm not counting or anything. Yeah, well, we are nearing or probably a little bit past the hour mark. And this has been great. We've covered a lot of ground. We've gone deeper into the USSR, which I think we really need to do more of, but you're really one of the first scholars to write about Soviet Jewish history in the post-World War II era, or culture in the post-world. Why do you think that is, though? Why do you think nobody's really going there yet?
I think because the turf is so murky, right? It's not, I think, yeah, it's a lot of it is about reading between the lines.
Yeah.
Right. I think the stuff from the 1920s and 1930s, but especially 1920s, and there's been so much work done on that by prominent scholars in the field, and your own work on on Odessa.
It was much harder to write the post-World War II chapter than the earlier chapters, even though
because
if you're scouring newspapers,
right?
Because
I think if you don't sort of read between the lines in those later periods, it doesn't come out very interesting, right? Because then it just comes out, well, here are these anti-Semites, here are these Jews that really didn't kind of know much and sort of, whose identity was thin,
Yeah.
to use that term. And that's where, that's why I wanted to come in, and of course I'm not the only one who's done that, but to really do that kind of the work of excavation, and see what's under the rubble, because I mean, thinking about the Soviet Union, even though so much of it has been revived through Putin, but still, it's a country that's gone, and it's a culture that's, it is like unearthing a civilization that's,
absolutely.
that's
Again, I found in my own work musicians like Leonid Utesov, who was the most popular guy in the USSR, the most recognizable face after Stalin, it was said, and better looking than Stalin. But he's constantly winking at his audience in memoirs, and you could read his Russian memoirs, and you could pick up the Yiddish inflections, just like you could watch a Seinfeld episode, and pick up the Yiddish inflections.
And any Jewish reader,
any
Jewish reader picking up, Utesov's memoir would be able to pick up on that, even those who knew not a single word of Yiddish, right?
Yeah, and I wouldn't even necessarily label it as resistance. He still considered himself, a Soviet.
Oh, of course, yes. That's the thing, is that Soviet element really needs to be appreciated seriously. And
he owed his entire career to the USSR, his entire mobility that he got.
Right.
So he might have not been happy about the way Jews were treated, but again, there's a little bit of resistance in there with the way he's winking at his audience, right?
Right.
Yeah, no, there's a terrain there that really needs to be excavated. I hope there's material. Obviously, nobody's getting into a Soviet archive for many, many decades, either in Russia and probably in Ukraine, Ukraine is where scholars have been going for the last 10 years or so to do archival research, or the Baltic states.
And it is possible. I mean, and hopefully will become more.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be running there anytime soon to Ukraine to do research.
The Russian archives, that's a difference.
Though that's finished. Yeah, no, it's going to be a long time before, as Jeffrey Herf said, it'll be many, many decades before Westerners get in there. But, people wrote Soviet history before the 1980s. It wasn't all necessarily good, but they did do it. They just had to rely on different sources that were not in the archives. So I guess it's sort of a return to that, which is too bad, because people are only now beginning to explore the post-World War II era. And I'm sure there's material in some of those archives coming from Soviet leaders, directing them to do X and X involving anti-Zionism in Israel.
Oh, absolutely.
And that would really lend, the necessary political and social history to the discourse that you and Izabella Tabarovsky are analyzing, right? We don't know where it's all coming from, but it is coming from someone above. It's just not magically happening.
Right. I mean, all these, yes. I mean, the Soviets were actively supporting communist parties in the West. And again, this particular guy, Hyman Loomer, who's also writing about how good it is to be a Jew in the Soviet Union.
In what
year?
He
has a brochure about that, and this, saying we've got to dispel all these myths about Soviet anti-Semitism.
What year is he writing in?
In the 60s, I forget the exact, but yes, yeah. So it's clearly fully coming out of the the Soviet Union. And kind of one central figure, which I discuss at length in my book in this respect, is Aron Virgelis, who was a chief editor of the only Soviet Yiddish magazine,
What's his name?
Aron Virgelis, who was on the one hand, propagandist and, going to the West to talk about how great it is for Jews in the Soviet Union. On the other hand, also writing a lot between the lines, and informing his Jewish readers, and actually just putting forth the idea that Jews are one people, no matter where they are, in Moscow, in Kiev, in New York, or in Tel Aviv. And then you have these anti-Zionist ideologues going after him.
Is he writing in Yiddish?
Yiddish propaganda.
He wrote in Yiddish? He was writing in Yiddish, you said?
He was writing in Yiddish, but this book in particular, his travelogue to the West, was also published in the Russian translation.
Okay, there couldn't have been that many Yiddish readers in the.
No, there were not. There were not. Yeah, but he was also publishing in Russian, and kind of saw himself as a chief Soviet Jew.
Right.
But what I'm saying, kind of that area where on the one hand you have propaganda, on the other hand you have some instances of subversion. Right, those are linked, and that's what makes this later Soviet material so interesting.
Yeah, when they decided to when they republished Isaac Babler, reallowed his publication in 1956, I have a copy of that first edition that came out, and it's fascinating to see what was removed, from the original text. I mean, there's still things that he said that are off limits, and they
Yeah.
can't be in there.
And right, and that edition actually had a preface by Ilya Ehrenburg. So anyway,
Yeah.
prefaces are good example again of that kind of what was getting between the lines. And but for anybody who's interested more, learning more about that, read my book. Yeah, it's
Yeah, the book is terrific, or at the very least, read my review in the Jewish Journal. Also, read Marat's article in the Jewish Journal, which is called Lahavdil, which is a Jewish term that most Jews will recognize, or How I Was Censored for Being a, quote, Zionist Professor. Yeah, and it makes for very disturbing reading.
yeah.
It's very disturbing. Yeah, and if this were not a state based on the rule of law, you wouldn't be here talking to us tonight, probably.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Just one last thing I'll say. For the first time, I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, and I was defending my dissertation proposal in front of a committee of whatever, four professors. And one of them, who was actually a big supporter of mine and thought I was wonderful, and I was about to write, proposing a dissertation on Jewishness in Russian poetry, in Soviet poetry. And so this professor turned to me and said, "Why do you want to write about this? Are you a Zionist?" And I looked at him and I said, maybe I am, maybe I'm not quite sure what that has to do with my scholarship. But then I just thought, what if that question was asked if I was in, my native city of Khmelnytsky in Ukraine in whatever, 1975, right? A question like that. And then you say yes, and then you're shipped to where you're not going to be, so well off. And so that was the moment when I realized, first of all, that connection between the Soviet stuff and what's happening here, and that something is really not okay when a question like that is asked. Why do you want to write about this? Are you a Zionist? And from then on, it just went kind of downhill to where we are today. And being a refugee from the Soviet Union and confronting this is interesting.
My little anecdote here. My first year teaching, at Ohio University, my first teaching gig. I was teaching Zionism in Israel my second quarter there, I think. And a student looked up, on the very first day and said, "Are you a Zionist?" And it's like, you're asking me that right now? I said, you'll have to wait till week 7 to figure out what my politics are. Right. But then he admitted to being a hardcore Marxist-Leninist, and I tried to explain to him that ship has sailed. I ended up becoming friends with him on Facebook. He was a good guy, just a little mixed up. But the year before I graduated from Berkeley, I was teaching a Western Civ course at this digital arts college where they needed to have, a 5-week compressed Western Civ course. And there was one student who I will say later gave a presentation in which she wrote a love song to Mussolini, one of the most disturbing things I've heard. But one day she just looked up, obviously they knew I was Jewish, but the course had nothing to do with Jews. And she said, "Are you a communist?" And, immediately, depending on what the politics are of the student,
right,
you're going to get labeled with one of those things.
Yeah. And of course we know all about the, the McCarthy era, but here we are. Are you a Zionist? And so now that I am divorced and on the dating world, and very early on in conversations, I now say, before we proceed any further, do you have a problem with the state of Israel existing? Just existing.
That's it. That's all I'm asking. I said, do you want its liquidation? Right? Is that do you have a problem with that? And I'm in the South, so most people don't. But I've come to realize that it's an important thing that I need cleared. One person on first date actually said, "What do you think of the Palestinians?" Just out of the blue, And it's like, okay, you're working with Jewish stereotypes here and making certain assumptions about me, and you really should not be asking me that. Yeah. So we are getting interrogated. We are getting subjected to litmus tests.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and maybe it's impacting my dating life. I don't know. Okay, well, to finish off, this has been a terrific podcast. I think it's
thank you.
The longest one yet, but it was well worth it. It's packed with interesting material about the USSR, about the United States and the left, and about Reed College. And we have a genuine victim here, if you don't mind me calling you a victim of.
No, I don't. I'm okay, but I think the larger problem is.
But we need to document the individual case studies, or people keep saying, what evidence, and they start trotting out numbers of this and that, this number of Muslims were attacked on campus. Aren't you concerned about that? And it's like, we can show there's issues here. And we are going to have a student on our podcast at some point who has experienced anti-Semitism on campus. We want to hear from them.
Yes, that's important.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. This was fun.
Thank you for a terrific show. and have a good night.